Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very, very special. I have with me Philip Chase, and we're going to be talking about Tolkien's essay. I just forgot the name of the essay on fairy stories. I don't know how I forgot that. This is really an important essay for me, theologically and philosophically. I use this in my master's thesis to defend the God world relation. It's really fun to think through, but I haven't really thought about this essay from a fantasy perspective, which it was written for. So I just, here I'm this theology student grabbing all the theological elements and stuff, but that's not even like the main purpose of the essay. So I wanted to have Philip on. One of you guys suggested I get him on, and I'd been listening to his stuff already. So I was pretty stoked about that to talk about the fantasy elements of it. So we're going to go all over the place and chop up this essay and bring you guys the goods. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen over on Patreon or YouTube members. If this is your top 5 or top 10 favorite podcast, then please consider becoming a Patreon patron or a YouTube member. Every little bit helps me keep the lights on, helps me feed my dogs and my new baby daughter. So that would be huge. Thank you guys. Not too much commodification here today. Let's jump in with Philip Chase and talk fairy stories and Tolkien. Philip, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Parker. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to chat with you about this essay, which it goes way back. It was a lecture back in 1938 originally, and it's been published as an essay since in many places. And it's been pretty influential, I think, on how people think about fantasy, what it does, and where it comes from.
Yeah, totally. It's awesome. I love that. Before we dive in, I had been I'm taking a deep dive into science fiction and fantasy. I love the stuff. I never really had time for it because I was working on degrees in theology and philosophy, and now I'm finally doing it myself, and I'm writing some. So I've been looking, over BookTube and trying to venture out into there, and I found you and your conversation with Jared Henderson. You had talked about Earthsea, and I thought maybe you're mispronouncing something. I'm like, what is he saying? And I finally found it's Le Guin's fantasy stuff. I'd seen her for science fiction and was like, look, I'll leave the fantasy alone. I like Lord of the Rings, and I like Conan. That's enough fantasy for me. But because of you, I went out and bought all of her Earthsea stuff. So I'm looking forward to diving in on that as
Oh,
well.
fantastic! That's great to hear. Yeah, she's a deep one.
Mm.
Look, it's just tremendous, and I admire her prose so much. There's just so much beauty that she imagines that she is capable of conveying in so few words.
Mm.
So I hope you'll enjoy the Ursi books.
Yeah,
They're
especially.
magical and inspirational for me.
Yeah. Well, on that note, though, I want to introduce you to my audience who may not know who you are. I'm merging these two worlds, at least on my channel, the theology and then the philosophy and then the booktube world as well. How'd you get into fantasy?
Wow. I think the quick answer actually is Tolkien, although he wasn't the first fantasy series I read as a kid. I was probably around 10 or 11 when I read Lloyd Alexander's The Chronicles of Prydain, which is very Welsh inspired. And I enjoyed it and I wanted more. And I read Lord of the Rings when I was around 12 years old. And that was when the door sort of opened and I wandered in and I never really, I never came back.
Yeah.
So into the realm of fairy I went. And yeah, I know it affected me deeply as a kid. Even I finished Lord of the Rings, got to the end, turned the final pages, and I didn't know the word catharsis back then, but I experienced catharsis at
Hmm.
the end of Lord of the Rings. It was just I was absolutely blown away by the experience.
Um, that's awesome. So did that shape your I mean, I think that shaped your studies as well. Can you say a word or two about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, not entirely consciously, but I did end up doing a PhD in medieval literature, specializing in Old English, and I studied on some Old Norse and other things. These are things that Tolkien was an expert at. He was a scholar of Anglo-Saxon of Old English, essentially, and yeah, just a brilliant linguist. And there is a linguistic basis to his world, to his subcreation, as it were,
Mhm.
which is a word that he uses in the essay on fairy stories. So yeah, I mean, he was very inspirational for me.
Yeah.
for sure. And in terms of my reading taste, but also the path my life has taken. Yeah.
Yeah. That's huge. Uh, what did you do your dissertation on?
My dissertation actually was about a chap who was very influential for Tolkien, in fact,
Hmm.
named William Morris.
Okay.
He lived 19th century, so he died just before Tolkien was born. I think like a couple years, but yeah, he was is very one of the early writers of what we call fantasy. Back then, it was not called fantasy. In fact, even when Tolkien gave this lecture in 1938, fantasy was not the word for the
Yeah.
genre. Uh, that was a little bit later, but nevertheless, William Morris wrote what back then in the 1890s were called prose romances, and
Mm.
Tolkien read these when he was a young man, and they were very, very important for what Tolkien would eventually write. So you can see him reference William Morris in his letters. So yeah, he's a big one, William Morris, who's in the tradition of the kind of romantic reaction against industrialism and capitalism that feeds into Tolkien as well. So not just an influence in terms of the matter that Tolkien takes up, but also the way he views the world.
Mm.
Tolkien also was very much unhappy with the state of modern society, with all the machinery and the industrialism and whatnot. And part of his essay on fairy stories is very much a call to recognize fairy stories as being very natural in the sense of being in tune with nature, reminding us of our connection to nature and to each other. So that's a really important aspect of the essay too.
Yeah. Even he even goes as far to say they're more natural than us,
Yeah,
which is
that's
pretty
right.
well. And I see some C.S. Lewis in there too, where he's writing about his argument from reason and such, where we're supernatural beings. Um, I thought that was I love his. I don't know if you want to call it critique or not, but I love the depiction of industrialization as being a certain type of industrialization as being wicked, and the other type is still kind of industrialization, but it's more along the grain of reality, the hobbits and such, as being
Yeah,
good. But he doesn't go for like full blown American like transcendentalist type,
no.
like we have to go out and live in he still has good mills working and stuff, and like there's a appropriate way to industrialize, I guess.
Yeah, you could say that, and I think the hobbits and probably Tolkien himself, enjoyed that pipe weed, and you
Mm.
have to have a
Yeah.
certain way of gathering that,
Right.
producing it. So yeah, I think that's there, but he was fundamentally I think he felt a sense of crisis in what he saw happening to the countryside around him, and
Yeah.
the willingness of many people to despoil the beauty of the countryside in order to make a profit from
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's very much part of the romantic tradition in that sense, I think.
Yeah. And I want to get more into your stuff in the back end of the essay too, but it reminds me of this difference between the US and Europe. So in Europe, he can look out at this meadow and be like, my ancestors fought a battle here, for this stuff. Here in the States, it's like I live in Illinois, so there's lots of meadows, and I think they're beautiful and awesome because I like endangered turtles. So I'm like, there might be a Blandings turtle in there. Everyone else is like, there's West Nile virus, there's mosquitoes. Let pave it over, make it a bunch of condos. But I can't say like my ancestors fought there, for hundreds and hundreds of years because we haven't been here that long. But over
Right.
there, especially, he has something he has even more of a claim, even more of a lament where it's like, "No, there's history here that you're completely despoiling, as well as nature," right?
Yeah, no, yeah, for Tolkien, he was very much in tune with the landscape, but also I think it was a matter of being in tune, as you say, with the history around him. It's pervasive. If you've been to England, you know that you could in any given town you might have a medieval castle not very far away, but also a church that goes back hundreds of years, maybe even 1,000. You could have a mound in not far from the village where it was once upon a time a hill fort or something like that.
Yeah,
Back even before the Celts were there, and
yeah,
and people are just it's there, it's just part of their everyday life. Whereas there have been people here in North America for a long time, of course. And when our ancestors, and I say our ancestors, I mean Europeans came here and did their best to eradicate those people who were here. And they, in many places, like here on the in the East Coast,
Mm,
particularly, there aren't a lot of signs of the people who lived here prior.
yeah.
So yeah, that is an unfortunate fact. So yeah, but with Tolkien, that sense of history, that sense of the deep past and how it informs who we are, how we're connected to it, and how it's a reminder of how things are lost and life is fleeting. Everything is ephemeral. These are themes that he gets from his engagement with Old English poetry, and you see them really at the heart of his storytelling in Lord of the Rings and even in The Hobbit, and most especially in the Silmarillion.
Mhm,
Yeah, that the where are those who came before us? The sort of ubi sunt theme that you see in
mm,
all over the place
right.
in Old English poetry.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, one last thing about you, and then we'll get into the specifics of the on fairy stories essay or speech. Are you currently like do you have students? Are you at a university?
Yes, I actually teach at a community college,
Nice.
I'm actually just the semester just started.
Yeah.
So I do have plenty of students, and I have taught fantasy novels as one of my courses that I actually
Mm,
created at my college. And yeah, and I haven't taught this essay in an undergraduate situation. I taught some graduate courses before, though,
mm.
and I'm pretty sure I included it in some of those.
That's awesome. I love having, one foot in and out, like doing so, in the philosophy world, it's like there's public philosophy and there's pure facing philosophy, and I think the same kinda thing with you. It's like actually teaching this for credit to a student who needs to learn certain things, but then also doing it on YouTube. I just think it's the best of both worlds, so it's cool to see it's cool to see you doing it as well.
Yeah, no, it's fun, and the audience on YouTube is actually willing. They actually clicked on the video on
Right.
purpose.
Right. That's right.
Whereas some of the students are sort of like hostages in there,
Yeah.
forced to take those courses, the poor things. Uh,
Yeah.
but the cool thing is when you see them actually get that spark,
Yes.
and you see them interested in it and learning, and that's my job. So I'm
Yeah.
supposed to show them that.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, like I've said, I read this paper initially for a theological, systematic theology master's thesis, and the
Yeah,
subcreation thing was key. But that meant that I read as someone like gleaning ideas, and so I was like, I don't care about certain things, Talking like that. You leave that alone. I'll go over here. So I went back over. Um, Having said that, I still don't know. Maybe I just didn't read it clear enough, but I don't know if fantasy and fairy or fairy stories are synonymous for Tolkien or not.
yeah.
Are they the same thing, or is fantasy a subgenre of fairy stories? Because I think fairy is supposed to be like the world, and then the fairy story is like I don't know. You tell me.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's confusing because of our word in modern times for the genre, fantasy.
Mhm.
Tolkien does use the word fantasy in the essay, but he does mean something else by it.
Okay.
For him, fantasy is an element of fairy stories,
Okay.
and what we are calling fantasy today, I think he would include among fairy stories. Now, there is a distinction. He clearly understood this between much older fairy stories, myths, legends, that sort of thing. The sort of communal property of a people. These old stories and on the other hand, modern fantasy, which is written by an individual using the imagination, often in engagement with much older stories, but still it's an individual author. It's not communal property. It's from the imagination of a person. But I think for the important points, these modern fantasy stories have a lot in common with fairy stories. Now, what does Tolkien mean by fantasy when he uses it in the essay? That's actually something that he talks about for a while. He connects it with the concept of wonder.
Mm.
And he makes fantasy. I'll see if I can find this idea of arresting strangeness. This is
Yeah.
a term that he coined actually in this essay. And I think I can find a passage where he talks about that. But arresting strangeness being this quality of having we live in the mundane world, and often our existence is very trite, especially as we are slaves to the modern concept of making our money and materialistic things, and often we are blinded to the wonder that it pervades creation. And
Mm,
this is something that Tolkien was really eager about. This is one of the reasons why is in the romantic tradition here, when he is pleading for us to recognize fantasy not only as legitimate literature, not only as literature that helps us to make sense of our struggles, as all literature does, but also as literature that has a special ability to open us up to the wonderful, to
mm,
the fantastic. And this is where he brings in the concept of fantasy. And he says, fantasy, of course, starts out with an advantage, arresting strangeness. This is the special advantage of fantasy. Fantasy is, in this sense, I think, not a lower but a higher form of art, indeed, the most nearly pure form, and so when achieved, the most potent.
mm.
So, when he's talking about fantasy, he's talking about the art of bringing out the wonder, that
Yeah,
sense of, and for Tolkien, even I think it edges into the sense of the numinous, right? The sense of the divine in the world that pervades the world, because he was, of course, a devout Roman Catholic,
yeah,
and he brings his faith into this essay, particularly at the end of the essay when he
yeah.
talked you catastrophe and all of that stuff. Yeah,
Mhm. Well, Philip, so, that the end of that quote where he's talking about it's the most pure form of art,
yeah.
it it hit me the other day as I read it again. I was like, "What the heck is he talking about?" And then I thought, is that because it's not using a medium, like paint? Like, it's not oil painting, which would have this medium, and so it's maybe less pure, not in like in a moral sense, but in a sense of just pure, raw imagination. We use our words even in our mind, and so the idea of forming this fantastical story is more pure because it's not using secondary means like art is, like oil paint or something. Is that what he means by a pure? It's more pure. It's the purest.
I think it has to do with imagination.
Okay.
And then fantasy is a genre that frees the imagination perhaps more than any other. And so, in that sense, it engages in pure sub-creation, right? Whereas if I'm writing a novel that's set in our day and age, I am obeying certain strictures. I am portraying the world as I feel that it is. Yes, it's still fiction and I'm still making up things, but I am less able to let my imagination soar. And so Tolkien says, in a sense, again, I'm reading from his essay, that is, which combines with its older and higher use as an equivalent of imagination, the derived notions of unreality, that is, of unlikeness to the primary world, of freedom from the domination of observed fact. In short, the fantastic, right?
Mm,
So he's essentially saying that fantasy is unique in that sense, that it encourages the soaring of the imagination.
mm. Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. A random one here is about the level of description going on in the fantastical work. So sometimes people will be like, people who don't appreciate Tolkien, which I don't understand, but like, Can you stop talking about trees? It's a little bit too much. Can you stop describing stuff? Can you stop?" Um, but then
Yeah.
I think of Herbert, who Frank Herbert would have really intense conversations, and you're like, "Oh, I'm right there with him." But then he'd be like, "Oh, and guess what? A sandworm came by." And you're like, "Well, what did it look like?" And he's like, "Never mind. Anyways, back to talking about water." And he wouldn't describe it at all. So it's like, I think I know what a Balrog looks like. I don't know if I know what a sandworm looks like, except for all the depictions of them, but none of them look the same actually, because he didn't really describe it. Which one is more freeing of the imagination? One has more strictures. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we're talking about a development among readers, a preference for less description, I think, these days.
Mm,
And so Tolkien, as a person who he read much older literature,
yeah.
and the older literature tends to be heavier with description and exposition, but modern readers really prefer their dialogue and their action, for the most part.
Mm,
So that's partly a product of just the preferences of the times. I do think sometimes that a lot of the modern preference for action and dialogue over description and exposition is it's in part at least a product of screens, storytelling
mm,
on screens. The screens have trained us
yeah.
essentially to want action and dialogue all the time. And yeah, that
Probably comic books too, right? Like,
Yep, yep, it's visual. You're getting
Yeah,
the scenery right there and then. So yeah, that's fair as well. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. Uh, Another jarring thing for me is that he's like, fairy is a noun more or less equivalent to an elf. And I'm like, well, I live over here. I was born in 91. That's not true. Tinkerbell is a fairy,
Yeah.
and Legolas, your Legolas is a elf. Is he pulling on something deeper? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, can you explain that? Help me out. I don't get that one.
Sure. Yeah, no, for him, when he says fairy, in part, he means not the little creature with wings, and that he's actually writing against that, in
Yeah.
a way. He's saying, "Look, I'm not talking about Tinkerbell here. I'm not
Mhm.
talking about these cute little." In fact, those you've reached a point where you've squeezed a lot of the ironically, of what he's talking about, the fairy out of fairy in a way, because he made it cutesy and all of that. When he's talking about fairy, he's talking about partly about the realm of other world, let's say, the realm of wonder. But I think he's also talking about a quality here, a quality where you are steeped in the wonderful, right? You are steeped in that arresting strangeness that he calls, that he labels later on in the essay, and it's also a reminder of the beauty and the wonder of the world that we're in. In
Mm,
contrast to our sort of default mode, where we don't see the beauty around us. Fairy, he says, yeah, it's all about elves and stuff. They're part of it. But here's another quote from me. He says, "Fairies contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted."
mm,
Right? So, in that sense, as we said earlier, fairy is all about the natural, isn't it? It is all about the true basis of our existence, which we're so out of touch with because we have created these barriers between ourselves and what gave rise to our lives.
mm. Yeah, that's such a good. I love that. That's such a good point. Um, so Tolkien, he's got a lot to say about what fairy is, what fairy stories are, and he's giving all these parameters. One of the things he talks about is the magic at play, and you're just getting at that as well. He says, it can't be if you're going to use irony in fantasy or in fairy, um, you can't use it against magic as like you don't get to do that. And then another thing he says is you also don't get to use dreaming as the mechanism for building the world. I think like
Right.
if you wake up from the dream, that's not fair. You cheated. It's not right. Can you do you understand like why? Can you explain that the impetus for these two rules?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with his idea about sub creation
Hmm.
and a secondary world where he goes beyond the willing suspension of disbelief, which I can't remember exactly. I think it was Coleridge who originally coined that phrase, where we read a story and things happen that obviously couldn't really happen in the world we live in, but we're willing to sort of overlook that while we're reading in the story. Tolkien says for fairy really to work, you have to go beyond the willing suspension of disbelief and believe.
Yeah.
You have to believe while you're immersed in that story, you're immersed in a created world,
Yeah.
and it needs to feel real for the real magic and the wonder to be awakened within you and to change the way you see the mundane world that we live in. When you come back from that story, you have this new clarity, you have this new respect, you have this new sense of wonder. Like when I read about, Rivendell, or I read about Lothlorien, I have a forest behind me where I live here, and I walk
Mm,
in the forest, and I bet if I've been reading about Lothlorien, you better believe I'm looking around those trees thinking maybe there's an elf there or
yeah.
something, or I'm at least feeling a sense of wonder and beauty in the natural world that I'm in. So for Tolkien, belief is so important, and if you have a story where, oops, no, it was just a dream, you snatched away that belief.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
So,
does.
for him, it's a less profound experience
Mm,
if you set it up that way.
yeah. I think that's really good. That feeling real, that's why you get the really good debates with Tolkien nerds, Legendarium nerds, where it's like, no, that's not how this works.
Yeah.
No one needs to go. That's not how this works in the legendary. Like, no, it's just like that's not what Hobbit does, and you can argue about that because there is this. It's a systematic, built out world with
It's a
rules.
secondary world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
wonder. So I wonder about that building out and the secondary world. I wonder I think this distinction came after Tolkien, but maybe not because I don't know the literature that well. But I think it's hard and soft magic. Where like, is that the right terminology? Hard magic would be like that's all built out, like the spells have rules and stuff. Maybe I'm using the wrong terms.
Well, hard magic is something I think Brandon Sanderson coined,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
he's a very popular modern fantasy writer. Tolkien never would have heard this
Right.
phrase before
Right.
in his life. But the distinction that Sanderson makes is that hard magic is something that is almost sciency.
Yeah.
There is an explanation of how it works. And soft magic, which is very much Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
is where there's no explanation. It's mysterious. It just
Yeah.
is. Gandalf does stuff because he's a wizard. And that's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
You don't have to explain it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's a little bit of a false. Not that Sanderson is wrong, because I'm just saying that when people set up a sort of debate between soft and hard magic, it's a little silly. I think
Sure.
there's a place for both, frankly.
Okay.
But Tolkien would have been much more familiar with what Sanderson labels soft magic.
Well, so that's what I thought. That's what I was thinking. I was wondering. I'm wondering if Tolkien would reject that notion of hard magic. I know it seemed like he's using soft magic, or whatever, based on those modern distinctions.
Yeah.
But would he have said like, no, that you ought not do that. That's going too far in your world building, or do you think he would say yes, there's a place for it?
I
It's-
think that's a very perceptive question,
mm,
and I can only guess, but I would guess that Tolkien would not have been a fan of hard magic.
Okay,
Yes,
yeah,
he would not have been a fan of making magic into almost a pseudoscience.
yeah,
So yeah, I think
that's
that's a
good.
fair assumption. He's never asked the question, but
Sure.
I think that's how he would go.
Oh, that's good. That's what I was thinking. But it's good to hear it from you. So not
Yeah.
to blame you when I get in trouble for it.
Yes, you can blame me.
Good. Another thing. So more downstream stuff and applying it back to Tolkien would be, Le Guin. So I still have not actually, like, read her stuff except for her essays on science fiction and fantasy, which she's a whole different author over there too. Like,
Yeah.
she's like a critic of the genre. She's a philosopher of science fiction and fantasy, and it really gets things going, kinda like this essay here? Um, but she talks about, fantasy as like inner exploration and science fiction maybe as thought experiments. I could be getting it wrong there, but I wonder if Tolkien felt the same way because when he says like what is fairy good for, he's talking about escape, he's talking about constellation.
Yes.
But I didn't see him say similar things that Laguna was saying about inner exploration, and he's definitely wouldn't go in with like Jungian archetypes probably, I think, or the shadow self, he probably wouldn't like that, but, what do you think about is there a clash between the 2 or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. I think that some of the notions coalesce. And you mentioned a couple really important concepts that Tolkien defines in this essay, so we should probably talk about them.
Sure.
There is, first of all, we talked about fantasy already, and then there's recovery, um, and escape is an important one. And by escape, Tolkien means something positive here. With recovery, though, first, it is cathartic. It is, because we live in this world that emphasizes the material and the mundane. This recovery is the regaining of a clear view,
Mm,
overcoming the triteness that comes with familiarity. And he talks about it in his essay. Let's see if I can find where he talks about recovery here. Yeah, here we go. We should look at the green again and be startled anew, but not blinded by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves. This recovery fairy stories help us to make. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. So there's something fundamental that fairy stories, fantasy, can help us to regain something that we've been out of touch with
mm,
because of the state of modern existence. So that's a really important one that and that he emphasizes that. And alongside that is escape, which is for Tolkien, it's not just practical, but it's actually heroic. If you live in a world that is sordid and that is soul killing, and in its drudgery and emphasis on the materialistic, this is his reaction against the modern society. He says, "No, you shouldn't be condemning people for reading fantasy and escaping from our world. They should be commended for this." I mean, after all, he has this wonderful analogy of a prisoner
Yeah.
in the essay, right, where he talks about the prisoner who would could blame the prisoner for wanting to imagine better worlds than what is immediately around him. And in that sense, Tolkien regards the modern existence as much like being in a prison.
Mhm.
And fantasy is even in its escapism, it is an act of rebellion, actually. It
Mm.
is an assertion that, no, this isn't the end of our existence, that there is a deep wonder, that we can be more in tune with, and if we would just allow ourselves to perceive it. And fairy stories do that. They help us to re-engage with that sense of wonder, and, they have the capacity, to help us return to something that modern life has made seem less real, but it's fundamental to our well-being, that being in touch with that.
Mm.
So yeah,
He calls fantasy a human right later because of
yes,
his sub-creation motif, and I thought that was awesome, like, so
yeah,
good because we think, I don't know, I actually don't know how true this is anymore. I know, reading one of Le Guin's essays, she's like, "Why don't men read fantasy?" And she has really good reasons for it.
yeah.
Um, I don't know if it's true today any longer. I don't I'm not sure. I know that they like, reading Jack Reacher stuff, Gen Xer dudes really love Jack Reacher and
Yeah.
those kind of things. The Gray Man. I don't That's not fantasy, but, I wonder I wonder if people are you know more about this than me, but, are more people reading fantasy today, and are they doing it for have do you see them doing it for one of these more than the other? For, fantasy or recovery or escape or constellation?
Yeah, I don't think most people think it through,
Okay.
as much as, Tolkien and Le Guin have.
Yep.
I think you're alluding to Le Guin's essay on why, are Americans afraid of dragons, I
There you
think.
go. Yeah, amazing title. Yeah, so good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great essay. As well. And I think she agrees very much with Tolkien in that essay.
Mm,
She's talking the same language there, really, in that essay, in terms of, we have this emphasis, particularly in American society, but it's pretty pervasive in the modern world,
mm,
on the materialistic, and that we're very, hard nosed, and we're about the very important business of making money. And
yeah,
for men particularly, there's been historically at least an emphasis on success being equated with how much money you make, right?
yeah,
And so to be engaged in these silly little, books about fairies and elves and unicorns and stuff. I mean, that what's that got to do with making money, right?
yeah,
So there's a bit of that, but Le Guin really uncovers something much deeper, I think, in the course of the essay. And I would recommend it highly to, as well as Tolkien's essay, to your viewers for sure.
yeah. That essay really messed with me. These are all messing with me, but Le Guin's really messed with me because I she goes over 3 categories of or 3 explanations, and you broached a couple of them already, but yeah, I'm wasting my time, I could be making more money, there's more important things to do and such. And, I've commodified my reading so that I can justify it. I'm spending time reading this stuff because I have a YouTube channel on it. I have 9 YouTube channels, so I can
Oh
justify
my
it.
goodness! Wow, I don't know how you do that.
Yeah. Well, it's because I have this guilt in the back of my head. And yeah, maybe it is some of the Protestant work ethic that she talked about. Maybe it is,
Yeah.
some late, capitalism stuff. Maybe it's because I just have a daughter and I am the sole provider now, and I do need to do that.
Oh wow.
Um but when I read so I'm working through it myself, so it was actually really helpful for her to broach that for me because 'cause I'm like, "Man, I need to get straight on this. It's okay to enjoy reading some stuff." And so I started reading Conan again,
Cool.
and, I don't see I don't see in Conan stories I think reading Tolkien is important. I would tell people to read it because it's important, not
Yeah.
because it's fun. It is fun, but I'm like, do it because it's important. I would say the same with Le Guin and stuff like that. But with Conan, it's like, I don't know, man. This just seems like raw escape, and I'm not really on board. I can't. feel that way that Tolkien said where it's an okay thing, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to get there because I really enjoy the stories. He loves, a head getting cleaved. He's always cleaving skulls and stuff,
Yeah.
and it's like but it doesn't seem like, there's a deeper message there. It's like Conan wins. That's the message. Maybe I'm reading it too shallowly, but
No, but I would say in general, there is room in fantasy, of course, for stories that are basically functioning primarily on a level of entertainment.
Mm,
There's nothing wrong with that either.
mm,
I don't think that Robert E. Howard was trying to do something as thought out as perhaps Tolkien was in his essay
yeah,
expressing, and that's okay. There is a place for all of that. There are different kinds of fantasy, so many kinds. One essay that I appreciate very much that I would recommend to you as well is Stephen Donaldson. Now he's
mm,
the author of the Thomas Covenant series, which starts with Lord Fowl's Bane. And it was a groundbreaking series, really. I think Lord Fowl's Bane was from 1977, when a lot of people were just copying Tolkien. Donaldson was doing something genuinely, yes, inspired by Tolkien, but genuinely different, and taking it uh, fantasy in a new direction. But in his he has written a couple essays on epic fantasy,
mm,
and his assertion in these essays is that fantasy is the literature of reintegration. That's a phrase that he uses in one of the essays. That
mm,
fantasy is the literature of reintegration, meaning again, our modern world, we're made to feel absurd. We're made to feel small and powerless. That life has no intrinsic meaning whatsoever, and nothing we do matters. That's just sort of the kind of era that we're in.
mm,
Whereas epic fantasy is the literature. These are stories that say, no, actually, well, we do have meaning. We can find it. We can carve it out of this world. We can go on a quest and discover something. We can go on this journey that is transformative and empower ourselves. And so that's what epic fantasy can do. And there's a real psychological importance to that.
mm,
You know, and it's a kind of a you look at within fantasy, there's like I said, there's other kinds of fantasy. We have a lot of what's called grimdark these days, which I personally feel is fantasy's answer to existentialism. And
okay.
that's what I would define grimdark as is
Mm,
existentialism in fantasy.
mm,
But yeah, I think that a lot of really smart people have thought about this stuff.
yeah,
There is room within fantasy, though. And my main point here is for authors who are deliberately pushing these themes and ideas in their storytelling. And then there are some who are just trying to tell a fun story.
yeah,
But in the process, I always find that even the ones who are just telling a fun story, somehow these themes can bubble up from somewhere, from underneath, from the unconscious. And
yeah,
so I'm not going to say that, they're necessarily theme driven stories, but they're not without theme entirely.
yeah. That's a great point. Um, yeah, man, there's so many different ways I wanna go here. Uh, can I ask you fairy and, fairy stories are not synonymous with fantasy. You say our modern fantasy would probably be a subsection of fairy story?
Could be. Yeah.
What else would fit in there today? What else could we put in fairy story that's not necessarily fantasy, I guess?
Now that's a good question. So we do have other, I think, modes and genres. Now, for example, there's magic realism, right? But magic
Like,
realism,
is that vampire stuff or
no, no, actually, it's a genre, subgenre, maybe. It's something that was very has been very prominent in South America, also
Oh, okay.
India. Uh, um, you know, uh, Salman Rushdie is a good example of an author who engages in magic realism in his writing. But essentially, it is seen as more literary than the genre fiction, though.
Okay.
Um, and I don't think that um, the purpose often for magic realism is more to question than to affirm. I think these are often authors who are uh, also, you typically see a very mundane setting, but an element of the fantastic sort of invades, and then we just see what kind of happens.
Mm,
And really, to me, there is if there is a line at all between that and fantasy, it's a very blurry line because you will find plenty of authors who are labeled fantasy authors who will do exactly what I just described.
Okay.
So, but whether or not we actually find the kind of consolation that Tolkien is advocating in here, I don't think that that's the goal of most people who are writing magic realism. I
Okay.
think that we can associate that more with what Stephen Donaldson calls epic fantasy. If we want to stick with that definition that he gives, that this idea of consolation, which we haven't actually explored yet, we haven't talked about that key term or that key word that Tolkien coins in here. But it's much more than just a happy ending, isn't it? The consolation. It's where he talks about eucatastrophe and the highest function of fairy stories, which is the idea of the sudden joyous turn, right?
Mhm.
So uh, you have tragedy, you have sorrow, you have defeat. You have in the midst of all of this tragedy and defeat, there is this sudden joyous turn and a miraculous thing happens, and the world is saved. Frodo gets the ring right to Mount Doom, and then decides, no, I want this ring, but then Gollum bites it off of his finger and perishes. The world is saved. Hallelujah! And for Tolkien, that's an example of what he calls eucatastrophe. And of course, he relates this with his Roman Catholic faith to salvation, to the incarnation and crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, which is, for him is the ultimate eucatastrophe, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't think that. Let's emphasize too that this is not just a happy ending.
Yeah.
Look, this Lord of the Rings would not be an effective story if it just ended with everybody happy and rainbows and everybody's cheering.
Yeah.
There is deep sorrow. There is tremendous loss. Frodo can't stay in Middle Earth. The
Right.
elves leave Middle Earth. Tolkien recognizes the loss and the hardship of existence, very much so. So it's not just, happy, yeah, but there is this almost rebellious insistence that there can be good in the midst of all this loss and tragedy. There can be beauty. There can be wonder, and we can fight to preserve it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's so helpful. And he says the constellation of the happy ending. Almost, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. So it's like almost. He's not quite going there. I wonder what you think about that. We're way downstream from this, and so many people have copied them and changed things. And the best way to copy them is to go, well, I'm going to give a bad ending, right? Because it's totally not Tolkien. I didn't steal it. I give him a bad ending. What do you make of that? Like, how integral is that to fairy stories and fantasy that they're even if it's not a full blown eucatastrophe, the constellation of a happy ending?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's Tolkien's assertion there, and I thought let's let him speak in his own words. I'll read another passage here
Yeah.
from the essay, and then I'll tell you, I guess, whether I agree or not. What he says is this joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. So that's a beautiful passage that he
Yeah.
he wrote there. And he also says, continuing, it is the mark of a good fairy story of the higher or more complete kind that, however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to or indeed accompanied by tears as keen as that given by any form of literary art and having a peculiar quality.
Mm,
So I love these passages. Tolkien was a gifted writer in
yeah.
so many ways, and I absolutely affirm his advocacy of stories that give us a sense of hope and beauty in the midst of tragedy and sorrow and loss. That said, I do feel that fantasy is much bigger than just that definition. I think you can fit within fantasy lots of different writers who are more about probing. They're more about questioning. They're more subversive, let's say,
Mm,
than Tolkien preferred to be. There is room for that, I believe.
yeah.
And some of my favorite authors are much more subversive these days. We see a lot of that, but I do like hope. I
Yeah.
do like beauty and wonder and all of that. So I'm glad that there are stories like Lord of the Rings that give me that sense. But I also think it's important to be challenged, to look at the mirror, even when what we see there reflected is something far uglier and rolling in the muck, as it were. There are some really talented authors who, like R. Scott Baker, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but
Yeah.
he's a philosopher, so he's one you definitely
Oh,
would
nice.
he'd be. Yeah, he's a. I think he's ABD, but he had been in a PhD program in philosophy.
Yeah.
His world, and he has all these really wonderful, I think affectionate, but definitely subversive, takes on Tolkien in what's called the Second Apocalypse series, which consists of 2, series within that. So there's a trilogy, the Prince of Nothing trilogy, and then there is which begins with the darkness that comes before,
Mm.
and then there is a, tetralogy that follows that called Aspect Emperor. And, yeah, he puts out things like, "Do we have any free will at all? Yeah, probably not."
Love that.
Much more bleak world, that Baker is portraying here,
Yeah.
but engaging, in fascinating ways and asking important questions. So there's a place for that as well, I
Yeah.
think.
I think you're right. I was so obsessed with Philip K. Dick for a while, and I read, like, so much of his stuff, and I always tell
Or
people that he's like, C.S. Lewis, who did LSD and then lost hope. And
yeah,
so it's like,
yeah,
pretty wild stuff, but I'm like, I just love it. I don't really understand. I need to probably think through why I like that so much, but yeah, it's like, I'm sorry, Tolkien, but it's science fiction, so I don't need to you weren't talking about this,
yeah, yeah,
which
you're
is
saying.
funny. Um, uh I know that we can make mountains out of molehills, but he didn't like Dune, and I read his, little letter on, like, he just didn't like it. And I wonder if some of that is because of, like, there's no one really in charge in Dune.
Oh, it's
Um,
a portrayal of faith,
yeah, okay.
Tolkien was a man of faith. Dune is a story that exposes the negative side of faith.
Yeah.
One gives up one's capacity to think when one joins the cult. When you drink the Kool Aid, right?
Literally, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So it is. I think what Tolkien, whether or not he actually ever stated it. My guess is that Dune rubbed him the wrong way because it's essentially a story that portrays a very cynical view of faith.
Mm,
And he was a man who was a man of faith through and through.
big time, yeah.
His faith gave him all of this stuff we're talking about, the sense that life has beauty and wonder underpinning it. You know? A lot of that really is a big part, in large part, really derives from his faith. So I think that's why he didn't like Dune. Honestly, was that Herbert really was showing us the dangerous side of faith.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's my guess, though. And if Tolkien never actually said anything that
right.
specific about it, but I would think that that would
I
be
think that's a good guess, yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot to it, as well. He apparently liked, like, Asimov stuff, and I wonder if that I mean, there's no mention of God in Asimov, is like, "Hey, look, if there's any religion, it's the religion of reason, and that's what I'm putting out there." So I
yeah,
could see that, but also, I mean, you talk about eucatastrophe, Foundation is a bunch of eucatastrophes again and again and again of just,
yeah,
"Oh, wow, there it is. You wrapped it all up. I see. Alright." I mean, his
yeah,
character development might be lacking, but that's 'cause the big overall theme is kind of the character, you know?
yeah, yeah. I actually haven't read Asimov. It's one of my big gaps in my science
Hmm.
fiction thing, but
I might
that
have
would make
just spoiled it.
sense.
I hope I
Oh,
didn't ruin this.
that's fine.
That's good.
It's been around a little while, so I think
Yeah,
you're
it's true.
you're yeah,
That's true. So I've dove in deep on the sci-fi stuff, science fiction. I learned you're supposed to say SF and not sci-fi. But, so I'm this is like the first, uh, foray into the fantasy, so you're really helping me out here, giving me all these I'm writing down all the authors. This
Cool.
is fantastic. Um, Tolkien says that there's these 2 primal desires that fairy fulfills. One
Yeah,
is, survey the depths of space and time, and the second is to hold communion with, other things, like other irrational animals and rational creatures and beings. Um, I wonder what you think about that. Do you think that those are primal desires? And are that sounds like science fiction to me, right? Like survey the space, survey
sure.
So I wonder, does that demarcate fantasy? And actually, what I really want to ask too is throwing a lot at you. Do you think that the distinction between fantasy and science fiction is artificial and arbitrary, or does it actually pick out something real?
Oh, so I'll take the second or the last thing you just asked first. And I absolutely believe that it's an artificial
Okay,
distinction in many ways. I mean,
interesting.
there's you can say, yeah, okay, fantasy is about the impossible and science fiction is about the probable. Or you can say
Mm,
science fiction is about space and fantasy is about medieval swords and stuff like that. Or
yeah,
magic,
yeah, yeah,
science fiction, magic, fantasy. You can make all these distinctions, but in fact, if you look at a lot of stories, they're pretty hard to categorize. Like
yeah,
Star Wars, for example. Oh, it's in space, but what's the force? It's really just magic.
yeah, yeah.
Dune, it's got magic in it,
Doing
right?
stuff. Yeah,
It's got
witches
magic.
and castles. Yeah,
A lot of people would want to probably, burn me at the stake for saying it, but Dune is in many ways more fantasy than science fiction.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so I think that some of my favorite writers, like Mark Lawrence, for example, he doesn't care. He'll do if it's sometimes his books feel like fantasy, and other times like science fiction. Another one like that, which you probably should read if you're really into philosophy and science fiction and fantasy, for sure, is Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun.
I got it. It's over here on the shelf. I need to get into it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's a book where it's 4 books, if you want to look at it that way, but it's really 1 book. And it's just science fiction, fantasy, dystopian, whatever. Who cares?
Yeah,
It is what it is, right? And that is
yeah.
deeply philosophical. Another Roman Catholic, by the way, Gene Wolfe.
Yeah, yeah. And I read through, Sun Eater. I'm all the way up to date on that. So that and he
Oh,
took so
cool.
much he said he's
He's very much
been
Christopher
influenced.
Ross
Yeah,
inspired
yeah,
by
yeah,
Gene Wolfe. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
in a big way. I haven't read Sun Eater yet. I'm gonna actually start it, late this year or early next, but
Oh,
yeah.
nice.
But I have read, Book of the New Sun, and it's, that's definitely should be on your list.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, now going back to the other questions, that you were posing, um,
Do you remember 'em? Should I say it again, or you got it?
yeah, you can repeat
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. Sorry. So he says there's these 2 primal desires that fairy fulfills. One is survey the depths of space and time, and the second is to hold communion with other
Yeah,
things, like rational animals and stuff.
yeah. Yeah, the space and time thing, I think that's, in terms of space, we could be talking about imagined worlds,
Mm,
sub-created worlds, if you will, secondary worlds.
yeah,
And time, obviously, we could be talking about our own past, or probably more likely, the mythical past, right?
mm,
Which is really no time. It's outside of time. It's part of that cauldron of story, or the pot of soup, as Tolkien puts
yeah,
it, right?
yeah,
And there's this sense of uh, it's this communal property of story that has been simmering for time immemorial, and when things like he gives the example of King Arthur gets dipped in there, he emerges a much more mythical, legendary character than whatever historical person may or may not have existed, right?
mm,
So I suspect he means something broader like that, in terms of space and time. And in terms of connection, I absolutely agree. I think that this is this is something you see. I think it's fundamental to many religions and philosophies. You see it emphasized in Buddhism, for example, the idea that not only are we ephemeral and fleeting in nature, in other words, we're not going to exist forever, but we're also part of everything, right? We are
yeah,
connected with everything. That all of life is this interconnected web, and we all emerge from the same source. And there's this wonderful analogy of you, the individual entity, the ego, this little self that you think of as being, separate from everything else, you're actually more like a wave on the surface of the water, and you're a happy little wave as in the moment that you exist. But
Right.
really, you're going back to the water, right? And actually, you've always been part of the water, haven't you?
Yeah.
So everything is connected, right? That is something I really agree with Tolkien in that, who in his Christian faith would have believed in the continuance of the individual after death.
Mm.
But still, I think he perceived that everything is connected. That everything comes from the ultimate source of life. Let's
Yeah.
say, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. I love his bit about, King Arthur being in the pot and coming out, like, more real,
yeah,
because you think, like, no, that's he's more, mythical because we've added him into the mythology, but no, he's more real, and I wonder if there's, like, a a nice little connection between that and the folks who like using Jungian archetypes where it's like, well, the Jungian archetype, if they're real, like, those have been passed on for generations and generations. Well, what's more real than that? What's more real than we can never escape these themes? That means it's real, and I'm gonna die, but, saving your father from the underworld will continue on. And
yeah.
so, I actually saw a little nice connection there. I also see a connection maybe to, like, some Platonism stuff. I know people wanna definitely C.S. Lewis, but, they also
Uh,
wanna throw Tolkien in there as well and say maybe there is something more real there in the Platonic realm, which is different than the way we think of it as ephemeral, but Lewis has it so that, uh, people visiting heaven from hell can't even walk on the grass because it's so solid and firm.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, I think that's a really great insight, and I agree with you about the idea of archetypes being very close, in a sense, to what Tolkien's talking about when he talks about the cauldron of story, or
mm,
that pot of soup.
yeah, I love that.
That archetypes are these universal patterns that we all recognize. We all know the wise mentor when we see that figure in story.
Mm,
We know that Merlin and Gandalf and Dumbledore and Obi-Wan Kenobi, they're all
yeah,
the same dude, aren't they? We know their function. We know
yeah,
what they need to do, and that they need to at some point die and get out of the way of the hero so the hero can fulfill their quest, their maturation, all that. But the hero needs that kick in the pants first, and that comes from that wise mentor figure,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So, yeah, for sure. And I agree, essentially, that archetypes are some of the most recognized, noble examples of things that have emerged or are bubbling in that cauldron of story.
yeah. I wonder, so with your background study and stuff, I wonder, have you got into C.S. Lewis at all?
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
I
yeah, I
imagine
mean,
you
for
must
me,
have. Yeah,
Narnia was really, a essential part of my young life. I actually like his Space Trilogy even more.
yeah, I was gonna ask you about that too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I love the Space Trilogy.
yep,
Um, real quick, so there's this myth, I don't know how true it is or not, but that Tolkien and Lewis flipped a coin, whether they said, "Hey, we don't like what's going on in science fiction, because it's all these materialists and all the, aliens are always monsters, and we don't think that alien creatures need to be monsters, so let's write our own science fiction." Heads, I do time travel, tails, you do space travel, whatever, and they flipped it. And what I heard is that Tolkien came out with space and Tolkien came out with time and Lewis came out with space. Have
uh-huh.
you heard this ever? Have you heard this story?
I can't say I have, and I honestly couldn't see Tolkien if he had gotten the space
Yeah.
on the coin flip. I don't think he would have been terribly happy about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So I suspect that that might be apocryphal, but
Yeah, I
I
think so
don't
too.
know. I actually,
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
I need to
But
check into that more. But so Lewis came up with the space one, and when I think about it, I think it's I accept it. I wanna believe it as true, even though, it could be apocryphal. But
yeah,
I lament that we don't have a, Tolkien time travel piece. I'm like, "Dang it,
yeah,
that would've been
yeah,
what would that even be like?" But, yeah, the space trilogy with the first is my favorite. I know everyone likes, Paralandra, but the
okay,
first is definitely my favorite because
yeah,
I'm a philosopher, and so that's where he's really getting at the
yeah,
Platonic themes of the self and stuff.
Yeah.
But his characterization of other creatures as being, like, better than us is
Mm.
awesome. I love that, and, I think people have changed it around now since then, but I think that was pretty, innovative back in the day.
Yeah, well, it was, but it also at the same time, I think in many ways is part of a longer tradition, like Gulliver's
Mm,
Travels, for example. If
yeah,
you Gulliver going out into the world in the age of exploration, that's from the 1700s. And when people didn't know that there may not, be islands out there where there are tiny little people, the Laputians but especially when he shows up on the island of the Houyhnhnms, which are these horse people, did you ever watch Star Trek?
yeah.
Are you
The original, the first my dad made me watch all that when I was a kid, yeah.
Oh, good man, good man.
Yeah,
So, Spock is a Vulcan, right?
uh-huh,
And there's this continual kind of exploration of emotion versus logic and all of that through his character, or he's actually half Vulcan. He's
right.
he's always struggling, with this dichotomy. But yeah, the Houyhnhnms are really a lot like Vulcans in a way, except they're horsies, right? And Gulliver, poor Gulliver, meets them and thinks they're much superior to humans in their logic,
Mm,
and they're much more clear viewed, perception of the world. And he learns a lot about himself, as reflected by the Houyhnhnms as they learn more about his human society. So yeah, I think that Lewis is essentially doing something similar, in a way, having Ransom is the main character's name, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, having him go out and voyage and come back transformed by the beings that he's interacted with and learned about humanity in the process.
yeah.
Uh, Kind of an old story in a way.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so at the time of, like, the golden age of science fiction, it's, like, it's innovative, but really this people always say he's a man born out of time or lived out of time, and so because he's reading all the classics, he's got the, what is it? I call it the OHEL book, but the Oxford,
Yeah.
English literature in the 16th century. He's read, like, everything from that whole
Oh, sure.
100-year period. It's insane.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah,
he was
he's
another Oxford professor. So
yeah, right, yeah, but deep into, like, the history of things, which is so cool that he's able to pull that back out. I think that's a great point. That's fantastic. Uh, there's th there's 3 ways that, I think he's saying Tolkien's saying there's 3 ways to generate fairy stories:
uh-huh.
in independent innovation or an independent invention, inheritance, and diffusion. Um, I understand the first one, and I think I understand inheritance, but I don't have a great grip on diffusion. Can you help us with these 3? Do you have those on top of your mind?
Yep. The independent invention is kind of what now modern fantasy writers are doing, right?
Yeah,
Making up their own stories that engage with faerie, if they're writing the type of epic fantasy that Tolkien is clearly advocating. Diffusion is when it spreads from one place to another. So we live in a village where we tell this story about the thunder god, and we go trade with another village, and we tell them our story while we're staying overnight in their village, and then they tell their neighbors about that story. So the story spreads out, and as you know, when people share stories, they change as they spread out. So you'll see far away in space and time versions of that story, which you kind of like, oh, that's very similar to this story from this
mhm.
place, right? So that's diffusion. And then what was the third one?
Inheritance. Yeah,
Inheritance, yeah. So that one's pretty straightforward as well. I think that's where, yeah, your grandfather told this story to your father told it to you, and on a bigger level, it's the communal property. So the bard tells the story to the tribe, and the tribe hears the story. Another bard grows up, inherits the bard's position, and keeps telling the story, and it's passed on from generation to generation. That
yeah,
way.
yeah.
Yeah.
He's got this great quote, in the section on origins, which is similar to this. But it resonated with me so much. He says, he's talking about certain type of readers who make connections between stories, and I think it could be any one of these, right? Mostly probably inheritance and diffusion, where you're saying, um, he's referring to these readers, and he says they are inclined to say that any two stories that are built around the same folklore motive, or are made up of generally similar combination of such motives, are the same stories. And I'm like, dude, yes, amen. These people suck. no, it's not the same story. Yes, they have similar themes, but it's a different story. Stop doing that. And
Yeah,
I'm a Christian, and in the Christian world, Christians love to Christian, like, not academics, but people who kind of think of themselves as academics, find Gnosticism and everything. That's just Gnosticism. So they look at the Tron Legacy and they're like, that's just Gnosticism. Like, no, that's a beautiful work of subcreation, dude. What do you like? Stop.
yeah,
But it's like the demon under every rock. But it's so what he's saying here really resonated with me when people readers will say that story's a lot like this story, so it's the same story. And it's like, no, like I think he brings up Little Red Riding Hood, and he's like, in one of them she gets eaten, and the other she's saved by, woodsmen.
yeah,
So, yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on that as, like, you're an author, you write books.
yep,
Um, do you play with themes? Do you intentionally try to keep those out? Is it cool? How much can we play with and still be homage versus, straight up,
right.
jacking their stuff?
Yeah, well, I do think it's too reductive to just, blithely say, "Oh, it's the same story,"
Right.
and dismiss it that way. I don't like that. Yeah, and the fact of the matter is, all of us who tell stories in whatever way, these are a product of all the stories we've engaged with before
Yeah.
that swirl around in our minds. And it's like we've all got our own little cauldron of story in our brains, right?
Mhm.
Every story I've ever engaged with, is swirling around in there. And I don't know, maybe sometimes consciously as I'm writing, I'm saying, "Oh, I wanna do a little nod to Tolkien there," or "I
Yeah.
wanna do a little nod to Star Wars," or "I wanna do" whatever. But oftentimes when I'm writing, it's subconscious. I will sometimes have someone point out to me, this is a lot like, whatever, Le Guin's Ursi in this moment. I'm like, "Whoa, I never thought of that. I didn't do that on purpose, but did I steal it from there? Who's to say?
Yeah.
I certainly haven't written it exactly the same way, and this goes back to archetype. This is communal. These are they exist for a reason. These patterns, these characters, they
Mhm.
exist for a reason. These are things that we have to engage with. I think
Yeah.
these are things that are part of our existence and that are calling out to us to ponder and turn over in our minds and see from different perspectives. And so they exist within stories for a reason. They're tools of story, but they also pull story in various directions, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that we can make too much sometimes, especially these days when we prize innovation and originality. We can make too much of, denigrating authors where we can see the obvious
Mhm.
influences. And I think as you write more and you produce more stories, it gets a little easier for you to disguise, where you're getting your inspirations from. But the fact of the matter is, I think that if we're being honest, there's no author anywhere in the world that doesn't steal from
Mm.
other stories,
Yeah.
from other people's stories.
Yeah.
I mean, we used to be much more honest and open about this. Shakespeare, for example. Do you know
Mm.
how many plays he actually made up the plot for?
Mm-mm.
And among all his plays, two, just two
Wow.
plays. Every single other play that Shakespeare wrote, he stole the plot. He plagiarized the
Mm.
plot from somewhere else. Now, he transformed it in the process of telling it in his way.
Yeah.
Often he changed it in very fundamental ways, but they were much less, I know we have copyright and we have all this, legalities and all of that. But back then, they were just unabashed about, taking stories from somewhere else and making them part of this story and all of that. So, by the way, the two plays are A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempests are the
Oh,
two plays
nice. 2
where
good ones. Yeah.
he just made them up, we think, and they're the most fantastical, actually. You could
Yeah.
label them straight up fantasy if you want.
Mm. That's really good. Well, and this is also part of, Tolkien's essay, it's subcreation, he does
Yeah,
emphasize we're it's a human right because we are sub-creators created by a creator, but also same thing, like, we're sub-creators from those whose shoulders we stand on as well,
yeah, yeah,
and all the other stories that we have and we're cobbling together. But his analogy of the soup, it's like, yeah, we're not looking at the full ingredients list. You probably can't, like you're saying too. I
right,
don't even know all my influences, but you don't do it that way. Read the story, and
right.
I thought that was really helpful. Really good. So I just started I used to write short stories and I stopped, but I started back again,
Cool.
finished another degree. And so now they're really philosophical. They're probably way too ham-fisted, but I'm working on it. I set a date to start a novel. I'm pretty excited about it. And
Awesome.
one of the points is I want to make a green sun because Tolkien talks about
Well, he
that,
talks
right?
about a green sign. Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
well, he's like, look, if you're gonna make green sun, you got to explain why it would fit in your world. So I'm like, okay, well, it's a challenge for me. I'm
Yeah.
not trying to like steal it. I want to. He's the master, and I'm trying to take up the challenge and be like, let's go. I'm gonna try and do this thing. Let's do
I
it. And
love it.
then the
Yeah.
Tolkien fans will be like, dude, he put in a green sun. Like
Yeah.
that. So that'll be fun if that comes to fruition.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Yeah,
I wish
yeah,
you best with that. Much fulfillment in that project and all your
yeah.
writing.
Thank you, thank you. Well, on that note, this has been awesome, by the way. I wonder if you can give us some plugs for some of your books.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I have written and published a trilogy called the Edan trilogy, Edan. And the first book is The Way of Edan. And my short plug is that it's Beowulf meets Buddhism.
Well,
So
okay.
yeah, for the philosophers out there, there's a little bit of a tease, I guess. But the backdrop is a holy war, and they members of a certain faith who believe that it is fundamental to their faith to forcibly convert the rest of the kingdoms around them, and that is the starting of this holy war. And then there are others who are from these other cultures who are resistant in some different ways. So yeah, that's the premise really is that a holy war. So I'm exploring, it's an action oriented adventure kind of thing, but I'm
Hmm,
exploring some of the themes we've been talking about, you know, um, connection and how we are connected to other people, even those we think of as other, as different, as foe. We are all connected in one way or another through our humanity, but also to the creation, all of life, right?
hmm,
But yeah, I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at characters whose worlds are changed by these vast events around them, figuring out what their identities might be once they're ripped away from the familiar.
yeah.
So, yeah, it's something that I worked on for a long time, for 18 plus years. I wrote this,
Wow,
yeah,
it's awesome.
and finally published it last year. I decided to publish all three in one go. Not quite
Nice.
one go, but in the same year. So yeah,
Yeah, that is pretty much a one go. That's awesome. Is
yeah.
there any I've been meaning to actually get your stuff. I wish I would have had it and read it by now. Um, is there any old school like Gaelic and Old English and I mean, from your own
Oh,
studies, did you slip any of that in there
oh yeah. How long do you have?
or?
So yes, I indeed. There are various cultures in this world that I have sub created.
Yeah.
From Tolkien. And the main one that you sort of meet at first is based on Old English. There's also one based on Old Norse.
Mm,
There's one based on Welsh, or it's sort of a Celtic vibe, and then there's another culture in there that I've lived in South Asia for a while, and so I have a culture there that is based on that. And I've actually stolen from these various cultures the languages as well. So when you hear characters speaking in the one of the Endumaic kingdoms, as I call them. If you're a speaker of Hindi or Nepali or something like that, you can kind of make out what they're saying.
ah, nice.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I get up to in there in terms of the creation of cultures and stuff.
Well, I'm so glad because I would have been really disappointed if not. Because 'cause I'm like, "You should put that in there. You got a PhD in this." Like, if someone read my novel and when I get it out, like, you ought to see some philosophical stuff going on, or I'm
Sure.
like, it's weird. It's weird to not include your other, academic interests, so I
Yeah.
love that, man. I'm excited for it. Yeah,
Cool. Well, thank you. Yeah. Appreciate
yeah.
you giving me a shot.
Yeah, definitely. And so then I'll put a link to your channel in the description, but it's Philip Chase, right? You can
Yep.
find
That's
just
me.
Google
Yep.
or YouTube Philip Chase and you'll find you how long you doing this 4 years? Over 4 years?
Yeah, over 4 years, about 4.5 years, I've
Okay.
had a YouTube channel, which, I started basically with the premise that, hey, fantasy is worth critical exploration.
Mm,
And that was the beginning of it. And here I am, still having fun. 4.5 years later. Yeah.
It's awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for your time and helping me think about this essay a little bit more deeply.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Parker, for inviting me, and I had a really great time chatting with you.
Awesome, man. Yeah, hopefully I can coax you into coming back on, talk about something else. That'd be
Oh, for
great.
sure. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, folks, that's going to have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensies. And as always, all glory to God.